this is Mr. Taylor, and this is a video on free will and determinism, which is on the ethics part of your philosophy and ethics paper. Now, the spec says that you need to know a few things about free will and determinism. You need to know the conditions for free will and how this impacts on moral responsibility. You need to know different perspectives on free will and determinism, which include libertarianism, hard determinism and compatibilism, and finally you need to know their relevance towards moral responsibility and most importantly towards reward and punishment. So why is freedom a condition of moral responsibility? Well, a person can only be held morally responsible for actions they freely chose to make themselves. Some people argue that a lot of our actions are actually determined by other factors and therefore we do not have any moral responsibility for them because we are merely puppets being pulled along the string. However, Christians believe that we are born with free will due to being made with the image of God. And this is most accurately summarized in the story of Adam and Eve, when Adam and Eve both choose to eat the fruit and decide for themselves the choice between right and wrong. This can be seen as them using their free will in order to disobey God, and therefore they had moral responsibility in their actions. So, the first perspective we have on this is determinism. Determinists believe that we have no free will at all, that our actions are determined by factors beyond our control. And there are three types of determinism. There is scientific determinism, psychological determinism, and theological determinism. First, we'll take a look at psychological determinism. So psychological determinism started with behaviorists such as Skinner and Pavlov. They argued that we are a product of our genetics and our upbringings. Human actions are a consequence of how we've been psychologically conditioned by our parents through reward and punishment. This is seen in Pavlov's dogs, when Pavlov conducted an experiment where he fed dogs while ringing a bell and found that even if he didn't feed the dogs and rang the bell, they would still salivate in excitement for the food. This shows that their actions were determined by the experiment before them, and all our actions are therefore caused by different factors such as our upbringing, our development, our parents, and our friendship groups. Theological determinism, however, is very different. Theological determinists such as Aquinas, and not so much Aquinas but definitely John Calvin, however Aquinas does make reference to this idea of theological determinism as the idea of predestination. The idea that God is omniscient means that he knows every option that might happen to you, and as a result of him knowing every option that happens to you, are you not determined to do whatever God knows you are going to do? This is why people like Calvin argue that you are either born to be saved or born to be condemned, and this is decided from the moment you are born due to the fact that God's omniscience means that he knows exactly what will happen. And finally, the final form of determinism is scientific determinism, where you are determined by factors such as your society you live in, the context of your birth, and different aspects of your life. They say that humans are not free because every situation is determined by a prior natural cause. This idea suggests that the chemistry, the physics of the world have some way of determining our actions, and we actually operate in a very small box within this world around us. In many ways, we can only do the things we are able to do. Scientific determinism makes the point that you are determined not to fly because you cannot scientifically fly, and therefore, due to the nature of our human existence, we are determined in a variety of different ways. Now, there are some strengths and weaknesses. So for our 15 markers, we need to be aware of the strengths of each position and the weaknesses of each position. In regard to determinism, there is a lot of scientific support from chemistry, biology, and physics, particularly out of post-Enlightenment empiricism. We can see much evidence towards our behaviour being determined by external factors. You can also say that it's understanding to people's contexts and takes into account the reasons why people commit these crimes instead of condemning people to just be morally bankrupt. Lastly, it is possible to hold this viewpoint and have hold this viewpoint that some factors determine our lives and the view that we have free will, which we'll look at later when we look at compatibilism. Some of the weaknesses of determinism is that they are not all accepted with scientific fact. There is no empirical evidence for predestination or theological determinism. There is also a sort of moral ambivalence to determinism, which results in people not needing a justice system, that if everyone is determined by their actions, there can be no moral responsibility, and therefore punishing people for crimes makes no logical sense. In fact, in many ways, it's oppressive to the people because they had no choice in their actions. Another reason is it always provides an excuse for behaviour, that if you can constantly say that it's not your fault, that no one ever takes responsibility and therefore there is chaos in society. And lastly, you could argue that determinism makes belief in God pointless. If we have no choice in our actions and what we do, then why should we follow the Bible or try to achieve heaven when it's already been decided for us where we are going to go? The next perspective is libertarianism. Now, the libertarian perspective, in its most basic form, is that you have free will. In its most simple form is that you are completely free and therefore have moral responsibility for your action. Your key philosopher is Kant, because Kant argues that an ought always implies a can. Therefore, if you ought to do something, that surely means you can do it. To go back to my previous example, you can't fly, so you ought not to do it. However, Kant would say something like you ought not to steal, and that is completely possible to do. The law ensures that we are truly free, and it makes sure that and not following these laws and not taking responsibility for our actions prevents us from reaching our summum bonum, which is the ultimate aim in Kantian philosophy. And Kant is always concerned with how your actions bear on other people. Look at the categorical imperative, where he says not to use people as a means to an end. Kant would argue that free actions should never impose on the freedoms of others, that to maintain a good society we need to make sure that all our freedoms are upheld and we are using them in a morally responsible way. So the first strength of libertarianism is that it creates a society where people are morally responsible and therefore have culpability of their actions. This makes a society much easier to manage, as people who should act in a certain way are punished and people who are acted in other ways are rewarded. Another strength of this perspective, it avoids the issues of determinism that in which people's lives are sort of almost fatalistically drawn out for them, with no opportunities to change their situations. However, a few weaknesses of this perspective is that we know some actions are psychologically determined. We often say when a child is being on trial for some horrendous crime that we look at the parents and the upbringing. Does this not suggest that in some way that they were not morally free? Could we say that the murderers of James Bulger had complete moral responsibility considering they were only 10 at the time? There are other factors that we can take into account where we can assume that people don't have moral responsibility. For example, people with disabilities might be a bit less psychologically capable of making decisions for themselves than others. We could also talk about people being forced into actions. There's a big point made that Kant's view of free will only works in a democratic society. Can we argue that the people of North Korea are truly free to make their own decisions considering the oppressive government they live under? Our final perspective is compatibilism. Now, compatibilism is somewhere in between free will and libertarianism and determinism. They would argue that although many of aspects of our lives are determined and we have no control of it, that isn't logically inconsistent with the idea of free will. Now, philosophers we associate with this movement are Aquinas and Hume. Hume argued that things are uncaused or happen as a result of mere chance. However, he also believes that humans are free. Hume goes on to say that we don't blame things for things they do ignorantly, but that we do blame people for things they do knowingly. And therefore, some actions, he argues, are determined by other forces, while some actions are the result of freedom. Now, lastly, Schopenhauer argued that man can do what he wills but cannot will what he wills, which gives you an idea of the compatibilist perspective, that although we can choose what we do, we can't choose the context of our birth, our upbringing, and a variety of factors that make us ourselves. So, The strength for compatibilism is it means that people are held responsible for their actions while taking into account mitigating factors such as mental health, disability, class, upbringing. It combines the theories together and finds a middle ground which seems to take into account both perspectives. Criminals are also rehabilitated under Hume's approach. So instead of an approach of kind of separating themselves for the protection of society or retributive justice in the case of the libertarian perspective, compatibilism has a view of justice that should be about rehabilitation and changing people so they can fit back into society. However, some of the weaknesses is very confusing where determinism begins and free will ends. They don't clarify what parts are determined and what parts are freely made, and therefore it can be a bit confusing as the reader of this philosophy to truly know what actions people are morally responsible for. There is also the theory of just deserts that argues that people should get what they deserve and not be rehabilitated. If you murder someone, should you be allowed back in society, or are you too much of a danger to others? And then some people do choose the wrong actions, and this is a completely free choice. And even though you could say that they're determined by different factors of their life, such as their upbringing, their class, could it not be argued that there are many people from poorer backgrounds that don't choose these actions? And isn't it fatalistic to just assume that these factors define your life and don't give you any agency in making moral choices? So these are our three different perspectives. So to summarize our three perspectives, determinists argue that our actions are determined by external factors such as God, our psychology, or even the biological conditions of our birth. Libertarians argue that we are completely free and have complete moral responsibility when it comes to our actions, particularly in regard to criminal actions. And lastly, compatibilists argue that there's somewhere between the two, that some aspects of our personality and our actions are determined, but yet we still have free will to choose in those within that context. So determinist, libertarian, or compatibilist? Which one are you?